Election Cafe with Fiona Stoker.
In the Election Cafe, we're giving you an alternative to the politicians. We've brought together journalists from across the political spectrum, spin doctors, bloggers, and even our own cartoonist who's sketching through the night. But it's not just TV. We're popping up every hour on the hour at social media, on bbc.co.uk/Scotland News, and on social media. The hashtag is hashtag BBC Election Cafe.
Well, we've got experts and politicians here as well, but as you can see, Big Ben is fast approaching. Well, let's get more reaction from our Election Cafe and say, for the first time tonight, evening to Fiona Stoker. Fiona.
Good evening, Glenn. We've had a little bit of time to chew over those exit poll results, and it is just a prediction, but let's see how that marries what this lot have been talking about and writing about. Kevin Pringle, formerly of the SNP, your first reaction?
It's astonishing. If the result's anything like this, it would be a dramatic setback for the Conservatives and for Theresa May in particular, who of course only went to the country in order to get an overwhelming majority, and on these figures she's got no majority at all. It's hard to even see her position could be tenable if this turns out to be anything like accurate. But of course it is only a prediction, and it could be very, very different when the results come in.
What about the SNP?
Well, interestingly, obviously that's a significantly smaller number than last time on these figures. It's only a projection, but that smaller group would have a very significant influence in the House of Commons on these figures, because if there's no overall majority, then that's a potential balance of power situation. So yes, a smaller figure, but possibly much more clout than we've seen over the past 2 years. But I suspect what's going to happen is quite a lot of seats are going to be won on relatively small majorities. So it may be that these figures are adjusted as the real results come in. OK, Anna Burnside of the Daily Record, you've had your calculator out. You've been doing some thoughts there. There was a gasp of surprise in the cafe. What's your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. You know, Theresa May called an election because she wanted a coronation, and on these figures she's getting a kicking. So, you know, what's not to gasp about there? It's extraordinary. And I mean, if these are anywhere near accurate, a just disastrous result for her. And we were just saying in a rather schadenfreude way, imagining the other European leaders sniggering at these results, you know, rubbing their hands in glee and just mocking her for this ludicrously bad judgment, if it's true. Obviously, if it's not true, then we're the ones who will be getting the schadenfreude, won't we? Indeed, and it is just a prediction, but former Labour MP Tom Harris, also a Leave campaigner, what was your first reaction when you heard that?
I was astonished. I mean, if this is, once again, the usual caveats, might not be accurate, if it is remotely accurate, I mean, Theresa May's position as Prime Minister is utterly untenable. She called an early election that she didn't need to call because she thought she was going to walk it. She thought she was going to have a landslide majority. On the Labour side, those of us who are critics of Jeremy Corbyn, who insisted he was unelectable, it's going to be far more difficult, if this is true, it's far more difficult to remove him now. Personally, I think he should still be removed, but it's going to be much, much more difficult. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Well, let
your calculations, right, scribbling furiously, but it's not, of course, just about words, because tonight in the Election Cafe is also about pictures. We have Neil Slorence from The National. He's quick in the draw and has sketched us something in the exit poll. What have you got, Neil?
Yeah, I've sketched a couple of things already, just like a shock reaction, because I think it's like pretty hilarious that she's called this election and then maybe lost her majority. That's a real shame. She did say strong and stable a lot of times. I don't think it's done the trick for her. It's a shame.
Well, I think you're going to have a lot of fodder tonight. Thank you, Neil. We'll keep you sketching. We're also all about social media tonight, and people have already been reacting on Twitter. Let's just have a look at this. Stephen Daisley, not again. Hashtag BBC Election Cafe. Hung Parliament. Gerald Kelly, BBC Election Cafe. SNP will win in Scotland. Hashtag no Brexit. And David Traynor, hung Parliament, I'll take that. So very interesting, and you can join in the conversation. Remember, it's hashtag BBC Election Cafe.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Let's bring in Brian Taylor and Professor Nicola McEwen, who's from Edinburgh University. Brian, first of all, it wants through the House of Commons. Let's get a bit more election gossip now and catch up with Fiona and her guests in the Election Cafe.
Thanks, Glenn. Well, I suppose this was the election that no one really saw coming, and I think that was the exit poll that not many people saw coming, if you could tell from the gasps from here in the Election Cafe. We've been talking a bit around the tables about the issues that people were voting on. We've got rapper and columnist Darren McGarvey with us. Now, Darren, on Twitter earlier on, you revealed that you had decided very last minute to go from SNP to actually vote Labour. What persuaded you to do that?
Well, I'm a yes voter. I believe in Scottish independence. Obviously, that by proxy means that I've been supportive of the SNP in the past. But as much as I was pretty sure I was going to vote SNP today, once I was actually in the polling booth, then I just felt like taking a punt. There's a lot of different things informing voter behaviour, and that applies to me too. On one hand, I'm thinking, I know what I want. On the other hand, I'm thinking, I know what I don't want. And then there's all of these other things that go on, the divisions in our culture, the people that annoy us on Twitter, all of these things. When I started to put the cross in the box, I imagined it was a very small hand descending over the mouth of Pete Wishart, and that might seem petty, but there's something about the Yes movement that I support, that the quality of the dialogue for me from some of the MPs that were voted in last time has not really been there. And Corbyn essentially calls my bluff. Someone who comes out of the radical left, he says, oh, you want radical? Here it is. He calls the bluff of the Tories. Oh, you're strong and stable. You look weak and unstable. He calls the bluff of his own party. He says, you really want this? Then go for it. And it's the same with the nationalist movement. What he proposes is something that's genuinely left-wing, something of genuine substance. I appreciate the restrictions on the SNP, and I think they're a formidable political force. If push comes to shove and there's another independence referendum, I'm behind them all the way. But that's not what this vote is about for me today, and that's why I decided to vote Labour.
OK, well, it is, of course, a prediction at this stage, and the SNP would still be the largest party in Scotland. But let's get the views of Alison Rao of the Herald. You were among those who drew breath when the exit poll results were announced.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it kind of, after the initial gasp, you think, well, it fits in with an anything can happen politics that seems to be prevalent, across the world at the moment. But once the initial shock settles, and after you've had a health warning about polls, even though they're exit polls, you think to yourself, well, where have those SNP seats gone? Who has benefited from this? Is it the Tories? Is it Labour? So it's going to be fascinating to see how the votes fall.
And what issues do you think people were voting on? Here's Darren saying that he was, he decided last minute to go for Corbyn, something radical. What do you think people were voting on?
I think they were voting mostly on IndyRef 2, and I think they were also taking a chance, even though they were told constantly this was not a Holyrood election, the issues were not the same. I think they've taken the chance to have a say on health and education. OK,
Penny Taylor, you're nodding there, journalist Penny. What do you think people were voting on?
Well, I think there's a huge cross-border divide, and I think south of the border we had a lot of discussion, for instance, about the dementia tax, capping care costs, about means testing cold weather payments, which wouldn't apply necessarily north of the border. And I think there was enormous confusion, because when I think you saw the Scottish leaders' debates, you saw health and education getting brought into that, even though Westminster MPs will have no locus on any of those decisions. So I do think, and I would agree with Darren and Alison, that there's been a huge movement for the take a punt, let's do something different. And I'm going to be curious to know what proportion of the vote is the youth vote. How much of this is young people who've been mobilised perhaps for the first time, because there's been a lot of action on Twitter trying to get people out there, and maybe it's worked.
Well, interesting points. Lots more to unfold, of course, overnight. We will have all the reaction from our journalists, spin doctors, bloggers, and, of course, our cartoonist who is sketching moments of the night. And remember, if you want to join the conversation, please do. It's #BBC Election Cafe.
Thanks, Fiona. In a moment, we'll be back with you when you're in fresh company. Let's cross to Fiona and see who her guests are in the Election Cafe. Fiona.
Well, the caffeine is flowing. The atmosphere is buzzing, largely due to a rather surprising exit poll result. And it is, of course, just an exit poll. It is a prediction. We're going to see what the guests are saying. I've got Kevin McKenna, Observer columnist and traditional Labour supporter, who's pro-Indy. Kevin, I wish there'd been a camera on the cafe at that time when the exit poll was announced, because there was a lot of surprise. What's your reaction?
Well, we all woke up all of a sudden and realised that a long night was going to get a little bit more interesting. We're actually hearing more astounding indications on the ground of what might be happening to a couple of seats in Scotland with massive SNP majorities, one of which could actually go to Labour. And if that does indicate a Labour surge in Scotland rather than a Conservative surge, then you wonder if it's a case of what might have been in Jeremy Corbyn's camp, because if he does indeed stop Theresa May getting an overall majority, he might be thinking to himself, if the Labour Party in Scotland had got its act together, what could have actually happened nationally?
Well, that's an interesting point. We'll perhaps put to our next guest, Evan Williams, who was a former advisor to Scottish Labour. What do you think about Kevin's point then?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. So Theresa May's had a terrible night and has had an awful campaign. And I think equally Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP have had a pretty terrible night as well. If the exit polls are to be believed, you know, they're going to lose a lot of seats. And they ran a poor and pretty unfocused campaign. So I mean, I hope the exit polls are about right, but it's a long way to go yet.
So what does Labour do now? Where does Scottish Labour go from here, do you think?
Well, I mean, when Kezia Dugdale took over, she had a lot to do. There was a long road to go, and Labour's recovery has to go through this point. You know, we have to be here at some point in order to get to the recovery that we need of getting, you know, about half of the people who went over to the SNP to come back to Labour. And so I think Scottish Labour will be very encouraged by it. I think they'll be very optimistic after the exit poll. And as the results come in, you know, we'll see just how optimistic they ought to be.
Indeed, of course, it is just predictions at the moment. We don't know the Scottish breakdown yet. Marianne Taylor from the Herald, you were one of those gasping. I wish we'd caught you on camera. A more interesting night.
Very much so, and I think if there is a Labour bounce, it's very much about Jeremy Corbyn. Interestingly, I spoke to quite a lot of SNP activists this week who were saying that out on the actual doorsteps, they were hearing from a lot of people that a lot of people wanted to see a way back for Labour. And they weren't sure, they were still undecided in their vote. And in some ways you can see that maybe SNP supporters on the left wing of the party may be more very tempted by what Jeremy Corbyn had to offer and by the overall thought of a Jeremy Corbyn moment, if you like.
Well, it was interesting speaking to our guest Darren McGarvey earlier on, who literally at the last minute decided that he would go radical and vote Corbyn. Do you think that's a pattern that's happening? And how's the young vote playing into that?
Yeah, I think the young vote would have a lot to do with this, especially in England and Wales, when you see Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto had a lot to offer young people, and if they were brought out to vote, then maybe this will have made a huge difference. Tuition fees, the anti-austerity message. It'll be very interesting to see how England and Wales have voted in this as well. For a long time, I think we've felt that there's been a real drift, and maybe there's be a more unifying thought. Throughout the United Kingdom. It will be very interesting to see how this changes things.
Indeed, very interesting. I just want you to note that Kevin has coordinated his tie with my suit. I'll let you digest the rest of what's been happening. Lots more to come, of course. Someone who's been up and down the byways and highways of Scotland, BBC's own Nick Eardley, has actually arrived in the election cafe. Nick, I think a more interesting night than perhaps any of us thought, but what are you picking up on the ground?
Well, I think there's a feeling with most of the parties at the moment that exit poll, they're treating it with a dose of scepticism. The idea the SNP could lose 22 seats, they're not quite at the point where they're entertaining that as a realistic possibility yet, but they are trying to work out where seats could fall from the SNP to other parties. Now, the Tories think the early tallies around the country are looking pretty good for them. They've been optimistic across the country, confident, not quite. I think that's starting to change a bit in some key areas. David Mundell, the Scottish Secretary, is predicting that they could win all 3 seats in the south of Scotland. One of them's his. That would mean them taking an extra 2. My sources also say that it's looking good for the party in Perth and North Perthshire. Now that is a fascinating seat because the SNP have held it since 1997. Pete Wishart was the MP in the last Parliament. He had been since 2001. He's a high-profile member of that old SNP group at Westminster, and them taking that would be a big result. Labour at the moment playing down the idea that they could make massive gains in Scotland. They think the majorities in some areas are just too big, but in Edinburgh South they sound confident, in East Lothian they sound optimistic. They also think they're doing better than they expected in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Lib Dems are quiet for now, but some people in North East Fife are suggesting that it's a close race there between the Lib Dems and the SNP.
OK, well, I'll get you more caffeine if you keep digging. Is that a deal? Brilliant. Well, lots more to come. It is going to be a long night, but I think it's going to be a very interesting night. Remember, if you want to join in the conversation, let us know what you think, or ask any of our Election Cafe customers what they think. You can get us at #BBC Election Cafe.
I don't think I got the message about colour coordination tonight, Fiona. I'll have to work on that. Let's cross to Jackie Byrne.